Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Stephanie Lopez. Today we will be discussing the issue of sexual assault. A new study reports 23% of women on college campuses say they experienced it. These assaults range from kissing to touching to rape. The study also reports that nearly 11% of women say the unwanted contact included penetration or oral sex. California is the only state in the country to have statewide college and high school affirmative consent laws. The law states that there must be an affirmative and voluntary agreement to engage in any type of sexual activity.
Well, I think you need to have that form of consent, and you should be able to tell with your partner, oh, they're feeling it or no, they're not. And if there's any hesitation, it shouldn't even be a question to continue or not.
Even though a person could give the yes at first, the affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout any sexual activity and can be revoked at any time, meaning that yes does not necessarily mean yes.
I don't believe that yes technically means yes, because if there's never a yes implied, then where is that coming from?
The law says consent cannot be given if someone is asleep or under the influence of drugs or alcohol.
If they're under the influence, then nothing should go between any of that, because they don't know what's going on, so they're not in a clear state of mind.
Some college campuses, including CSUN, have required educational programs for students.
I thought it was very rewarding for the students. Hopefully everyone took it very seriously because it is a serious issue. I definitely learned some different things that I did not know before I took it.
But others disagree.
I get why we need to know about that stuff, but a lot of it seemed really pointed and a lot of really obvious stuff. So a lot of it, I know a lot of kids didn't take it really seriously.
Educational programs dealing with sexual assault are a starting point, but the issue is greater than that. On Point, Sarah Vong has more on the story.
Thank you, Stephanie. Here with me today is former member of Project DATE and the current coordinator of the peer education programs in the University Counseling Service, Melissa Realegeno, and CSUN's Title IX coordinator, Susan Hua. Thank you for joining me today, ladies.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank
So
you.
let's begin with the study done by the Association of American University that says 23% of women reported sexual assault in campuses. Melissa, are you surprised by that number?
I'm not surprised by that number because I know that a lot of people don't report it, and I'm sure that those numbers are much higher because I know a lot of students are not comfortable reporting, so I'm sure the numbers are much higher.
Why do you think that some students aren't comfortable with reporting?
A lot of times because they know the person who was who sexually assaulted them. So I know if they were to know the person, they wouldn't want them to go to jail or harm them in any way, even though they did harm the victim. It's understandable.
And Susan, are you surprised by that number as well?
I think in some ways I'm surprised and in some ways I'm not, in what Melissa is saying, in that we are seeing the national statistic about reporting, and that's traditionally been very low. But I think that it's also worth considering the actual surveys and exactly what they're asking. So one way in which we try to gauge what's happening here at CSUN is to conduct our own assessment. And so last spring we conducted our Sexual Violence Prevention Climate Survey. And then we found that those numbers were lower here with about a 28% response rate from our students. So we look at that and we try to reconcile those numbers and see what we're doing here, what we're not doing here to be responsive to those types of incidents. But even definitions will affect those numbers. Like if we talk about, well, are we asking our students if they've ever been sexually assaulted, and are we talking about sexual assault specifically or sexual violence, a bigger umbrella, and does that include stalking and domestic violence and dating violence? So there's a lot of different categories in which we have to think about what are we asking exactly, so that we can really just figure out what those numbers mean to us.
So do you think that some people define sexual assault and rape differently?
Mm-hmm. They can, yes, definitely.
In what way?
They probably don't know that there's a difference to begin with. They might assume that sexual assault, they won't know this difference between sexual assault and rape. And I think that's where Project DATE comes in hand, because they go around campus, on and off campus, to make sure the definitions are clear and out there.
And absolutely, and in a lot of our efforts to raise awareness about what sexual violence means and can entail, we talk about different things like that, like sexual assault. What is that? mean? What does sexual battery mean? Rape, the fact that the intercourse is involved when we talk about rape, and domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And some people, especially students, don't consider stalking an act of sexual violence. And those are some of the things that we've seen in focus groups here to try to understand the landscape of what our students are experiencing and how they define their experiences.
So do you think that this survey will make people realize the danger of sexual assault on college campuses?
I hope so. I hope they're aware of it. The more we talk about it, I believe the more people are taking into account and hopefully wanting to know the facts about it.
Okay. And Melissa, so California is one of the few states to set down a law on affirmative consent. Can you explain what that law entails?
Yes, consent is to give permission, and there are 4 ways to lose consent: intimidation, fear, alcohol or drugged, force, threat, and disabled or unconsciousness. So people need to give affirmative yes consent, and if they say no, it's an automatic loss of consent. So it has to be a strong yes, and there's a yes means yes law. It used to be no, it means no, but they changed to yes so the person could say yes. And many times in the past, you would said, well, that person didn't say no, so they assumed it was a yes. So that's why it now has to be a strong yes.
I think part of that also, Melissa, to piggyback off Melissa's point, is that when people think about, well, what does consent mean? I think that there's big misconception that, oh, silence meant, oh, consent, or, oh, the person didn't fight back or push me off. And so that's consent. And this is really not revolutionary. It's an idea in which we are trying to raise awareness about what consent doesn't mean or what it does mean. And in this instance, silence does not mean consent, and a lack of protest in that way doesn't mean consent, because we understand that there are neurobiological implications having to do with trauma. And so when we think about survivors being placed in that situation, they may not react in a way that we typically think, oh, if I were in that situation, I would react that way. And so Yes Means Us is actually a bill that relies on a definition that we've been using here at the university before the bill was ever passed. So when we conduct investigations in equity and diversity and as a Title IX issue, that is a definition of consent that we have been using and that we apply when we are determining if there has been a determination of a violation. And that is that there's an informed, affirmative, mutual decision by those engaging in that sexual activity to engage in that activity.
So Susan, why is the federal government using Title IX to protect women?
Title IX is a federal civil rights mandate. So, and we talk about this all the time in terms of our efforts to raise awareness about sexual violence prevention, is that gender-based abuse and violence is a civil rights issue. It's an issue about oppression. And so Title IX is yet just another civil rights legislation that protects all people from gender discrimination, which includes sex discrimination, sex harassment, and sexual violence. And so it's not necessarily the federal government using that, I would say, to protect individuals from these types of harms. But there are a lot of laws, there are civil rights type legislation that are meant to protect groups that have been traditionally marginalized and require these types of protections. So it applies regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity.
So what is CSUN doing to implement these rules?
I think that, well, for one, Title IX applies to us because we are a federal, an institution that receives federal financial assistance, and so we apply in that context. But we also know that it's our values. We want to protect our students here, or any member of the campus community, and it's about really taking care of each other in a culture of caring. We talk about these types of interpersonal situations of violence as really about being a bottom line issue of respect and preserving someone's dignity. And so we've always had efforts here on our campus to address these types of issues. And just, I think this last couple of years, we felt that we really need to take a collective stance and position that these types of behaviors are not tolerated, it's unacceptable, And there's so much going on campus-wide, in which from every pocket of the campus, someone is doing something to raise awareness about it. So let's all get together and have strength in numbers and make sure that our students have access to all these different efforts, programming, events, whether it be Safe Week, whether it's things that the Sexual Violence Prevention Committee is doing, the investigations and events that we do, part of equity and diversity, individual departments and the curriculum that professors feel rightfully so that they should be infusing into what they're teaching their students. There's so many different efforts that we wanted to make sure the campus community knew about. And so these have been ongoing, and it's one of the leading charges for the committee to really bring that together and raise awareness so that people have access to these resources.
And Susan, how are CSUN employees being trained on preventing sexual violence?
So CSUN employees are also required, just as our students are, to take a training course. It is offered through their portal. They log on through their portal and their Skillport, and it's a course in which they learn about the same topics that we talk about with sexual violence prevention, including bystander intervention, and what consent means, what the laws are that apply, how to perhaps speak about rape culture and things like that. So, and just recognizing that they play an integral part in sustaining a safer campus community, because they do work here, and a lot of times they are the ones in which students approach to disclose that they've had some sort of experience dealing with sexual misconduct. So to help empower employees to deal with these types of issues is one thing that we're trying to push on a personal level and personal trainings, but also we have a mandated online program that they're all required to take.
Yes, I'm aware of the training, and yes, I think the training is a great way for people to know what stalking is and what harassment is specifically, because some students or anyone who is here at CSUN may have an overview but may not be aware specifically what it is, and they might see that it actually is there's a lot of boundaries that could be crossed, and that training is very helpful for them to know when the boundary is crossed and when it's not crossed.
Okay. And the survey also says that more than 50% of women didn't report some of the most serious incidents, such as forced penetration, because they didn't think it was quote unquote serious enough. Why do you think that they felt that way? Any thoughts?
That's a shame, right, to hear
Yes,
that.
yeah.
And I think that goes into some psychological implications of what this all means.
Definitely.
And how people process what has happened to them. And I think our role in that is to help find ways for them to process that and heal on their own timeline. You asked about efforts earlier, and we have hired as a university a campus care advocate, Katie
Yes.
LaRue, who is housed in our student health center. And so she functions as an advocate confidential resource for survivors who need advice and want to talk to someone who can keep what they talk about confidential, and they don't have to report it to the police or to me as a Title IX coordinator, although those things are encouraged to make sure that they are feeling empowered to hold the person accountable and to begin their healing process. So it is really difficult to hear those kinds of numbers. But I think that we're trying to help in little ways to kind of instill those steps in terms of empowerment, to know that it is a big deal, it is serious, and not that just because it's happening and it seems to be prevalent on a nationwide basis, that it's just an everyday occurrence. It shouldn't be that way.
Right, I think something like that is very, very hard to process and to understand what happened, because many people are in denial of the situation and just try to forget about it and move on. But that's something that's really hard to forget and move on. And it's difficult to learn how to process it as well. So I think that's where University Counseling Services will be a huge help. Also Katie as well for support. And there's a lot of support that is here for them.
So, Susan, I'll start with you. So what sort of impact does it have on someone who has been sexually assaulted?
What sort of impact does
it have on them if they were sexually assaulted?
Oh gosh, it's a whole level of things.
Yes.
And we do take those things in consideration when we're looking at adjudication of cases that come to our office as well, and the investigation process. So much of what we do, we try to take a trauma-informed model of approaching. Sometimes a survivor comes to speak with me, and the events as they occurred to this person does not come out in a chronological manner. And we have to understand that and be mindful of the neurobiology of trauma, and to understand, again, in terms of showing that they didn't consent to a particular act. Sometimes people freeze and there's a tonic immobility. And so the impact is manifested in how they react in that situation of trauma, how they then recall, and how it affects their memory when they talk about it. And you know, some people show emotion, some people don't. People process things differently. And so we're mindful of all of those things as well. And then the impact afterwards is just, we try our best to intervene when they want us to in terms of interim measures. So if someone is not, needs to be separated from the alleged perpetrator in housing or in the workplace or in a classroom, we help with those types of remedies. Obviously, it would start affecting, it may start affecting their schoolwork.
Definitely.
And concentrating in classes. And so we've had conversations with professors, again, with their consent, to talk about, hey, what are some accommodations we can talk about here to assist a student who's been through this type of trauma?
Yes, it's a huge trauma. They are likely to experience depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe even become alcoholics, unfortunately. So it's a huge, huge issue that needs to be addressed.
So do you think the victims usually know their perpetrator?
Definitely. Yes, it's a very high percentage that they will definitely know their perpetrator. It's very unlikely that it's a stranger.
Yeah. There's been quite a lot of research on the fact that it was either an acquaintance to some extent, or even someone they've been in a relationship with. And I would say the majority of cases that we see involve an alleged perpetrator whom they know.
So what are some of the tips one should keep in mind, let's just say if he or she is drinking and they were like hanging out with a group of friends or at a party? What are some tips you think that, or they should keep in mind?
So alcohol is a big issue, and
Huge,
again, I
huge.
can say in the majority of cases we see involving sexual misconduct, alcohol was a factor, or other drugs like marijuana was a factor, and that's a huge issue, and it kind of goes hand in hand, and we talk about it pretty frequently at our committee meetings to say, how can we tackle these issues, because there is a correlation here, and then we always draw back to, it's not a causal relationship, though. This is not to say that victims and survivors in any way, because they were drinking, you know, called for that kind of attention, called for that kind of action, and the fault is always with the perpetrator. So it's not to have any sort of victim blaming insinuation. But yes, we know that alcohol affects our ability to think rationally, and you know, make informed decisions, and that's with any sort of choices that we all make on a daily basis. And so we talk about safety tips in that framework, in that know your levels, right, of intoxication in terms of, you know, how do you usually react? Do you drink on a frequent basis or in social settings? What have you been eating that day? That sort of thing, to know how much is going to inhibit you, but also to have friends that you rely on to help take care of you if you're in an instance where you might have had a little bit too much, and of course, you know, having a driver and things like that. But just understanding what alcohol does to you in terms of your judgment is very helpful.
Definitely, yes, I agree.
So do you think rape is the least reported of all violent crimes? Why or why not? Melissa?
It is very, it is less reported. I'm not sure of how comparison of other crimes. I do know that it's less reported because of who's been sexually assaulted, who was a victim, and who was a perpetrator in that sense. So I do know it's very unlikely for people to report it. I can't compare how of other crimes as well.
It's got to be one of the least.
Definitely high up there.
Least, for sure, and it's because of things that Melissa just mentioned in terms of, you know, there's a sense of, because they know the perpetrator, it's like there's all these other implications. How is this going to affect that person and that person's family? And perhaps your own family if it's a domestic partner. These are very intimate circumstances, and nobody wants to sort of air and talk about details of an intimate circumstance either. There's victim blaming involved. There's wondering if anyone's going to believe you. And there's processes in the system in terms of prosecuting for accountability. So there's a lot of things that I think a survivor might take into consideration before reporting, and unfortunately that at times ends up discouraging someone. And that's something that needs to change in terms of systems, in terms of media, in terms of our culture, to say, hey, it's not okay and nobody tolerates this and you're going to be believed. And no one's at fault except for the perpetrator, him or herself. And so there's a lot we have to change about notions about masculinity, notions about what rape culture means. There's just so much going on here that I think goes into the mind of someone who feels discouraged to report.
Yes, I think the media and our culture has a huge it's a huge part of it, because the media can portray sexual assault as something that is not spoken of or doesn't want to be spoken of itself, especially our culture. It just likes to be swept under the rug. It's not a huge issue when it is a huge issue that needs to be addressed and talked about. I believe the more we talk about it, the more people are aware of the situation. I hope the more we talk about the hope they'll want to educate not only themselves but others as well, and hopefully break the stigma of all these common misconceptions and the things we hear in the media and people talk about, because it's everyone's issue, not only one person's issue that might have experience. It's everyone's, could be everyone's problem that we could all change.
So how can one prevent sexual assault or rape?
There's a couple of ways that they can definitely prevent sexual assault and rape. There's safety tips, safety apps, and knowing your limits when it comes to alcohol, and be aware of your surroundings, be careful where you walk. It's very, it's sad to say that I know that it happens to men and women, but it's sad to say that women are more scared of walking in dark alleys or outside at night. But it's just to be aware of your surroundings, walk with confidence, to know where you're going, have your keys ready to go, and walk with someone you trust that will walk you to your car, or call your friend when you get to your car, when you get home, here and there. So simple safety tips that everyone could use. It's just a matter of being aware, have confidence in yourself, and see what you could do, anything that could prevent for your own safety.
And I think there's something to be said about the notion that, while not all men are perpetrators, the majority of perpetrators are men. And so we talk about, why is this happening? And so safety tips are important and critical for anybody in any situation. When it comes to sexual violence, we need to start thinking, if we haven't already been thinking about, what is in the mind of the perpetrator to think that something like that is okay, or justified or wanted. And so we need to really start tackling what that means. And again, that's a societal issue, things that you would see in just a music video or something on TV, or when we think about sports, right? We've seen issues where celebrities have been prosecuted for domestic violence, and you hear, just anecdotally, you hear people say, well, she's still with him, or why did she marry him? And so those are things that people need to better understand, I think, and think about, psychologically, what does that mean? And how do we change that, instead of saying, well, why would he beat her up and throw her out of an elevator, right? Rather than, oh, well, she stayed with him. So it's things like that that we need to start thinking about, if we haven't already, and then just tackling those issues on a widespread basis, on a broader outreach to both men and women, and then think about the fact that a victim could be anybody, a perpetrator could be anybody. And we see incidents between same-sex acquaintances. We see incidents where the aggressor has been a female. So again, dispelling myths and these notions that aren't necessarily true, I think is helpful in preventing sexual assault and sexual violence.
Yes, it could happen to anyone. People assume that it's just a woman's problem, but no, it's everyone's issue, and we don't want to blame anyone. It's about educating people and trying to understand the situation more, instead of assuming what happened or assuming it's what they were thinking, when sometimes it's really hard to understand the psychological point of it all.
Or blaming it on the alcohol.
Yeah, that too.
So Susan, I'll start with you on this last question. So where do you think the talk about sexual assault should happen first? Is this something that they should be speaking to with their parents at home, or is this something that should be, should be learning from their educators at school or with their friends?
So yeah, that's tough because I'm a parent of 2 toddlers at home, and I think about the things that I see, and I think I'm gonna chain them up and never let them out, but that's not the way the world works. And with any issue, these are very adult issues if you think about it, but those are conversations that and this is without judgment, is that I think parents need to have in general, and they can decide when is the appropriate age level. But I think that it's a disservice when students don't hear about any of this growing up and don't learn about any of this in high school, and then all of a sudden they're in college and completely independent, the parents aren't around, they're still going through identity formation and meeting new friends and going to events and parties. And so I think that that sort of dialogue, we would be best served to have that earlier, and it'd be great to have pipelines continue between high schools and higher ed institutions to have that kind of dialogue, and those kinds of efforts be comprehensive and not just, reactive. If something happens, then okay, now we should talk about it. No, it's being proactive about it, because students, I think, sometimes are more mature than we think, and even if they're not there in terms of maturity, they're learning about it. And as they're learning about it and developing these ideas and notions of masculinity, femininity, that's the best time to have those conversations.
Yeah, it's really hard to say specifically when is the best time to talk about it. I do agree it should start with family, but I know when it comes to family, it could be very uncomfortable. So I feel like as long as they start talking about it as soon as possible when it comes to high school range, before college would be great, but I really hope they talk about it and take it as a serious matter, because it is a very serious matter that needs to be talked about and not misled.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining me, ladies.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
A single ember that escapes from a wildfire can travel more than a mile. You can't control where that ember will land, only what happens when it does. Get Fire Adapted now at fireadapted.org.
If you or anyone you know has experienced sexual assault, there are resources like the University Counseling Services at CSUN that can help. For all of us here at On Point, thank you for watching.